Hi, I'm Alan Ogilvy. I'm lead product manager at Friend MTS, and I'd like to introduce you to the first conversation about our series of white papers on building trust. I'm joined here by Chris Cook, a media and copyright expert from CMU Insights, who has researched and compiled this white paper for us.
Yeah, hello, my name is Chris Cook. As Alan says, I run a company called CMU. I'm a journalist by trade, but the focus of my reporting and my research has always been the media and content and entertainment industries, particularly interested in the impact of digital technologies on those sectors. I also have a focus on things like copyright and intellectual property. So it's really exciting to be involved in putting together this series of white papers. As Alan said, we're here today to talk about the first of those white papers on the copyright safe harbour, but we thought that we should probably start by looking at why we are doing this entire series and what topics we're going to be focusing on in the future.
Yes, so platform responsibility and online harms have become a big talking point among policymakers and the political community. Regulation is going to increase, and the corporate reputation of platforms is going to increasingly depend on well thought out and communicated policies in this domain.
Yeah, just in the last 12 months, there have been lots of developments in this domain, many of which have been quite newsworthy. With my journalist hat on, we have the European Copyright Directive in the EU that got lots of reporting. We're now seeing developments in the US. And then when it comes to other areas of platform responsibility, we've seen the leaders of big platforms being questioned by politicians in multiple countries. And we're starting to see lawmakers in the EU, in the UK and the US consider tightening up the regulation of the big platforms and indeed smaller platforms as well in all of the different areas that we're going to be covering in these white papers.
Yes, there's a lot of things to keep up with, and that's partly because the concept of platform responsibility actually covers a lot of distinct separate issues, including copyright, privacy, misinformation, cyberbullying, criminal activities online, extremist and violent content, protecting children online, so on and so forth. It's important to be clear which issue we're talking about at any one time, which is a challenge.
So the point of these articles is to help rights holders and platforms and what we're calling responsibility facilitators, like government regulatory bodies, law enforcement agencies and advocacy groups, to navigate and understand all of these different areas and to stay ahead in the ongoing debate.
So as a company, it's important for us to help the wider community to remain well informed, to encourage and facilitate debate around these topics. But understanding many of these issues means navigating often complex areas of law and contentious social debates, which is why we started this series on building trust.
Now, we mentioned at the start that we're here today specifically to talk about the first of our white papers, which focuses on the so-called copyright safe harbour. So I guess we should start with our focus on that white paper by asking, well, why did we make this topic number one?
Yeah, so we decided to put the copyright safe harbour under the spotlight first, as it has been particularly newsworthy since 2018 as a result of the European Copyright Directive discussions, a review by the US Copyright Office, and high-profile lobbying campaigns by both rights holders and platforms. So as we speak here in 2021, new proposals are being presented to the US Congress, so it's even more timely.
Yeah, an awful lot has been going on in this domain. So to get a full understanding of all of the arguments and all of the developments, what we did for this white paper was we spoke to some of the lobbyists who have been campaigning on these issues in both the EU and the US, and also to lawyers who work for both rights holders and digital platforms to get their insights and their opinions. And it's based on all of those conversations that we were able to put together this first white paper.
Yeah, so the white paper is relatively long, so you'll want to download a copy. We're just going to touch on some of the topics here, but perhaps you could take us through a few of those key points, Chris.
Yeah, so let's tell the story of the copyright safe harbour and also explain what the principle is all about. The story begins back in the 1990s when it became clear that we were moving forward to a time when pretty much everybody would have access to the internet. And that was a very exciting time. It was very exciting that everybody was going to have internet access. There were huge commercial opportunities as a result of that. But it also caused some concern for internet companies, and particularly internet service providers. What they feared was that once everybody had internet access, it was pretty certain that some of those people were going to use their internet access to infringe copyright, to access or distribute content, other people's content, without permission. And what the internet companies said was, if we can be held liable for that copyright and be sued for that copyright infringement, well, we can't take on that liability. Okay, it was simply the risks are too high. So assuming we want everyone to have access to the internet, which we do, then we need our liabilities to be reduced. And so that's what internet companies started to say to lawmakers. And basically a deal was done that was then put into copyright law, which was to say, as an internet company, if you provide networks and servers to another person, and that person uses that internet access to infringe copyright, providing you're not actively involved in infringement or aware of the infringement, you can't be held liable for it. And that's the basis of the safe harbor, but with some provisos in return. And the big one is what we sometimes refer to as the takedown obligation. As a safe harbor dwelling platform or company, you have to have a system in place by which a copyright owner, if they see their content being infringed on a platform, can make the internet company aware of that and demand that that infringing content be removed. So as a safe harbor dwelling internet company, you need to have a takedown system in place, remove content that's infringing when you're made aware of it, but providing you have that takedown system in place, under US law, you also need to have a repeat infringer policy in place, but providing you're ticking those boxes, you cannot be held liable for the copyright infringement of your users. That's the protection that is provided by this thing called the copyright safe harbor.
All seems so simple, but there are a number of controversies, aren't there?
Yes, there have been a number of controversies about the safe harbor over the years, generally complaints from copyright owners, from the copyright industries, whether that's the music industry, the movie industry, TV business, the sports sector. All of those copyright owners have raised concerns with the safe harbor. Although it's worth noting, the principle is sound. Those copyright industries are not disagreeing with the basic concept of the copyright safe harbor, more the way the safe harbor has been implemented and some of the possibly unintended consequences of that principle existing in law. So, for example, things like those takedown systems I talked about. Actually, copyright law doesn't go into any great detail about what those takedown systems should look like. Now, the safe harbor differs around the world depending on what body of copyright law it's coming from. So in the US, it comes from the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, in the European Union from the e-commerce directive. But most of those laws don't actually make huge demands about these takedown systems. And so plenty of copyright owners have issues with the way those takedown systems have been developed. Some companies have better takedown systems than others, but some copyright owners would say a lot of companies, they don't go far enough when it comes to takedowns. We need the law to be revised to make those obligations more clear and more severe, I guess. Under US law, there's also an obligation to have a policy to deal with repeat infringers, users and customers who just keep on infringing content. And again, copyright owners would argue that often those repeat infringer policies either aren't good enough to start with, or they're good on paper, but they're not properly implemented. And so all of these things have resulted in a number of controversies in recent years where copyright owners basically say the safe harbor, we don't mind the principle, but the way it is currently structured, the way it currently works, isn't good enough.
And a lot of those discussions and has been sort of industry news and everything, but some of those have leaked into headline news that other people know about. So maybe you could give us an example of that.
Yes, what is, I suppose in some ways, quite a dry copyright law topic occasionally ends up in the mainstream media. And I suppose the good example of that was when the copyright safe harbor was being reformed in the European Union through a thing called the European Copyright Directive. And a very specific element of the copyright safe harbor in Europe was reformed. That was focused specifically on what you might call user upload platforms, which often rely on the safe harbor. One of those is YouTube. And actually, the reason why this became such public knowledge is because these safe harbor reforms in Europe, in that copyright directive, what was initially known as Article 13, became positioned in the media as a big war between the music industry, with all the pop stars lined up on one side, and specifically YouTube. And it wasn't only YouTube being affected by this at all, but YouTube did put a huge lobbying effort to try and influence this copyright safe harbor reform. And both the music industry and YouTube, they began lobbying like you do behind the scenes in Brussels, but they both took their campaigns public. So that on the music side, you had musicians and artists speaking out in the press and on radio and on TV. Meanwhile, in Europe, there was a period where whenever you opened the YouTube app, you would get an alert about this Article 13. It ultimately became Article 17 in the final directive, explaining why, from YouTube's perspective, what was being proposed wasn't acceptable. And yeah, music industry versus YouTube, headline news. And so suddenly, lots of people who had never previously had any interest in this thing called the copyright safe harbor became very aware that it existed, and there were some issues with it.
Because there was things like, there was concerned about, well, I'm not going to be able to create memes, short memes of like videos and things like that. So that was why it got, got the interest of the general public as well. Yeah.
Yeah, you had a period where you had the music side with lots of artists and songwriters and pop stars coming forward saying, you know, the internet and this safe harbor is killing music. We need the reforms, otherwise we're not going to get fantastic new music in the future. Meanwhile, YouTube and its supporters, other internet companies, and also free speech advocates were basically saying the reforms that are being proposed here, well, kill the internet was a common term. It's going to kill.
I mean,
you've
got to go in strong to debate, haven't you?
Well, I mean, obviously, both sides were exaggerating. It was never going to kill music. It was never going to kill the internet. But yeah, I mean, there was some tough talking on both sides that, again, made it of interest to anybody who was tuning in, not just people running digital platforms, copyright owners, and lawyers. So as you can see, there are lots of different elements to the copyright safe harbor story, and we go through all of those in much more detail in the white paper that you should all download. But what we thought might be useful to do here today is to get Alan to give us what he sees as being his top 3 takeaways from our first white paper, the 3 most important things that everybody tuning in today and reading the white paper should be aware of and thinking about based on the research that we have done.
So I think firstly, safe harbor reform in Europe is still in flux as the European Copyright Directive is implemented. So it's not clear how it will work in principle and what resources will be available to the platforms. Rights holders in the platforms need to pay close attention to the ongoing debates. You know, while platforms need to anticipate the potential new obligations under law and plan out their roadmap for how they're going to build out their system to handle it.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about in the white paper is what a directive is and how directives work within the European Union. And what happens is all of the EU member states come together, they agree on legal reforms, those go into the directive. But then each country within the European Union then needs to amend their local laws to bring them in line with what was agreed at a European level. And with the copyright directive, that is still going on as we are talking here today, and it's not entirely clear how it will be implemented, because we've seen slightly different debates, for example, in France and Germany, as to how the copyright safe harbor reform should actually occur in reality. And so we're having to keep a close eye on the ongoing debate across the EU as it is implemented, although what is certain is that when it comes to user upload platforms, there will be new obligations and new responsibilities. And so if you are in that space at all, whether you are a big player or indeed a startup, you need to keep an eye on quite how it gets implemented and what impact it could have on you and your business.
So I think secondly, the next big safe harbor debate will focus on how those takedown systems work, with the rights holders pushing for takedown and stay down as standard. And that's a key part of the new proposals being presented in the US Congress right now. And how realistic is that demand, and what would it mean for the platforms? That's the question.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about the controversy around takedown systems and how a lot of copyright owners say that the takedown systems operated by some, or some would say many, safe harbor joining platforms simply aren't good enough. And this idea of takedown, stay down comes up a lot. One of the frustrations of copyright owners is even where you have a responsible platform that responds to takedowns when they are issued, you send out the takedown notice, the content gets removed, but within days, hours, minutes, another user on the same platform re-uploads the content and you have to issue another takedown. And people sort of sometimes talk about it being like a game of whack-a-mole. You're constantly having to issue takedowns around the same content. And so we're starting to see copyright owners increasingly say, do you know what? It shouldn't be takedown, it should be takedown and stay down. So once I've issued a takedown relating to one piece of content once, if that same bit of content gets re-uploaded to the same platform, that platform should automatically block or remove that content without me having to do any more work. And so we call that takedown and stay down. That's not an obligation under the current safe harbor regime, but some people think it should be. And this is where the US reforms become really interesting. We're starting to see this debate move up the agenda in Washington, and there are now active reforms to make the takedown obligation in the US a takedown and stay down obligation. Now, we've no idea how quickly those reforms will be debated in Washington and whether or not they will actually result in new laws, but it is going to be a big talking point within the US framework in the year ahead.
I think the third thing, kind of leading from that, is, on the other side of the fence, platforms are increasingly putting the spotlight on takedown processes for the rights holders, increasingly responding to copyright litigation by questioning the credibility of the takedown notices they receive. What should rights holders be doing to ensure the process for issuing takedowns is actually credible? That's the third thing.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about the criticism of safe harbor from copyright owners, but what about the platforms? And yeah, you're right. That is a concern the platforms often bring up, which is the quality of the takedowns that they are receiving. And they will accuse some copyright owners of being imprecise when they issue takedown notices or not being conscientious enough. So they're issuing takedowns against content which isn't actually infringing. Maybe it's fair use under the US copyright law principle. Or maybe sometimes turns out they don't even own the copyright in the content that they're asking to be taken down. And so we have started to see some platforms, usually when they're being criticized by copyright owners, hitting back and saying, well, actually, the way you issue takedowns is not good enough. Now, the copyright owners would probably counter, well, if we could get takedown and stay down and end the game of whack-a-mole, then we could be more precise and thorough when issuing our takedowns. But I think it is important for you to observe that there are criticisms on both sides of this debate, both of which we do cover in the white paper.
Yeah, so these three key takeaways are important for this article on the safe harbor issues. And I'd say the key message is that all of this is still evolving, as are all the other platform responsibility debates, such as misinformation, cyberbullying, abusive content, and all these things that we talked about. We'll be putting the spotlight on those in the next Building Trust white paper. Meantime, download the Copyright Safe Harbor white paper now, and the next series will be out soon. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much.